We should be on.
Hello, 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 everybody. I would love if more people could join, so we will probably wait 5 minutes. But, um, yeah, excited to be doing this. I want to say that we'll be doing this more often. The idea for us always has just been like find a way to, I guess, democratize the process. And I think a lot of design, especially apparel and fashion, happens behind closed doors, and it's always something that feels very closed off. And especially as people who, I would say, at least for myself, feel pretty like lucky and fortunate as someone who has like no formal kind of like training, and has kind of been able to like learn on the fly and really learn off of like peers who have been really open about like how these things work. And I wouldn't say, and especially leading to this, that nothing that we do is, I guess, conventional. It's, we're really learning with every project that we do, and everything that we do is kind of just a process that we think works and makes sense for us. But in that same way, I think it's interesting for us to kind of just to share this, just for anyone who's interested, to see how these things go. And I think even with our clients themselves, it's just been a great process of how can we have a level of transparency with them, and then hopefully have a transparency with their audiences as well, so we can create products that don't just feel like they happen behind closed doors. You don't see the process at all. It gets released, and then that's like the limit of your interaction with it. I think fundamentally there's something to kind of like seeing how things are made and seeing the motivations and the inspirations and where those come from, and that kind of affecting and just feeling like you're a bit more involved, and that there's a bit more of a story behind it, or there's a bit more of a passion behind it, that just makes it even easier for you to kind of like make that purchasing decision or just become more of a fan. I think at a high level, that's where the idea, at least for us, to make this a core part of what we do. Um, I know, for example, like we haven't done much public facing, and this is really the first one. And to that point, this is gonna be pretty lax, honestly. Like there's not much of a structure we built around this, and I think based off of doing this and hopefully feedback we get, we'll probably dial in a bit more. But on that subject, like this is really the first thing that we've done that's really public at all, which, intentional or non-intentional, like we've had plans in terms of like how we've wanted to have something that's public facing, and what that means for us. And I think fundamentally that's always been rooted in what's core, for why we did this to begin with, right? To create products that are meaningful, to bridge gaps between different spaces, whether that's fashion or gaming or sports or music or any of those things. Hello, Braid. Um, yeah, it's always been about that. So I think like we've been really kind of just working behind the scenes to make sure what we do when we are public with the brand is something that aligns with that. And I think like this is a good first step, but we have a lot of plans in terms of just like what those things are, but we really want to find ways to kind of contribute. I mean, for lack of a better way to put it, but just really bring creatives together, really focus on things like education and experiences and things like that. And I think, again, like this is the first step towards that path. Sorry, I realized no introductions at all or anything like that, but my idea is that you got here because you follow me.
Inside only, yeah.
Yeah, but for those who don't know, my name is Jason. I founded Superculture with my business partner Cordell, who's not on the stream. But again, fundamentally, the idea was we saw what was going on in primarily like the gaming and the influencer and creator space when it came to apparel, and we just honestly just thought that there was a better way to do it. People who could care more about the process, care more about creating meaningful products. So yeah, that's who I am. Let Felix talk for once.
Yeah, so I joined Superculture about 18 months ago, working alongside Jason in the design department. So me and him worked on both this 2022 and 2023 Mogul collection, very hands-on with design stuff. And I mean, that's kind of all there is to say.
Yeah. I am gonna be super unprofessional and go check my phone just to see what's going on.
I
And then
think
we can get
the one question I'd ask is the audio all good? I know we have music playing. Is that too loud? But yeah, other than that, sounds like you can hear us speaking. So we're doing something.
All right. So, wait.
We're at it.
Camera is
Everything As it was.
And there's the dog. You open the close.
Let the dog cook. Hendrik says, sounds wonderful. Let's run it.
Okay. So I don't know how many people do this, and this has always just been this like ongoing thing, but we do most of like our project building and at least like mapping out all our projects as far as it goes to like everything but the actual designs themselves on Figma. And yeah, one of those things like I don't know if who is doing that.
The Figma fashion house is real. Yeah.
And if that's, I don't know, good or whatever. But I mean, fundamentally, the first piece of the puzzle is just, it's collaborative. And for us, that's just really important. Also, it's really good at building decks. And as you can imagine, with any agency, we're building a lot of...
Everything's in and out quick.
Yeah. And the great thing, again, also it being vector-based, like we'll do a lot of stuff like Felix will work on designs, and then we're able to put them on mockups and like adjust colors and things like that as a team and collaboratively. And that's been really beneficial as well.
Obviously, a big thing with this project and 2023 was I was working remotely, right? So a lot of this work couldn't be collaborative in a physical sense. It was sending files back and forth. It was a lot of calls, a lot of communication that way. But being able to actively sit in a design file at the same time, make adjustments, you're not waiting. The time zone where, you know, you send over a file, you might get feedback 8 hours later. With Figma, you just set aside some time, you both hop in. I can drop vectors in, I can drop design files in. We can then workshop things internally, build the decks in Figma with the vector pieces, and then...
Yeah, we could like leave comments and things like that, which I think are also beneficial. And I think the one thing that's important here, and realistically, we're breaking down this project because did a poll and this is what everyone was voting for. But going back into this was really interesting because, like Felix mentioned, Felix wasn't even working here full time yet, and this was like so early on in like our business period. So a lot of like what I was looking back on was like holy crap, like
systems that don't exist that we've now put in place to make this smoother.
Yeah, like I don't want to say, and I still won't say that like our workflow or our systems are as organized or maybe as good as they could be, especially in terms of like documenting certain parts of it. But this was like, oh, like there was really nothing in place at all.
Wild West, the Figma files, yeah.
Yeah. So just going through like, again, like there's certain aspects of this that like, if we were to show, like if you were to ask me like, oh, hey, which one would be to show that's the most beneficial for this exercise? Just of like, oh, if we're showing process and things like that, I wouldn't pick this one because we've improved those systems and we improved how we do the work and how we like work with clients, especially like talking about like doing initial pitches and briefs and things like that. And because of that, I'll show another project just to show like what are the missing pieces of that. Because just, I guess where it's worth starting is like, where did this begin, right? We initially got pitched to do, I don't even know if we got pitched to do chess boxing.
No, it wasn't chess boxing. Yeah. It was originally just a chess theme capsule. This was right kind of post-COVID, chess.com popping off, Twitch doing PogChamps, everything like that, leading to Ludwig wanting to kind of introduce some chess themed merchandise. It was never designed with this grand event in mind. So you'll see through kind of the first passes on design that there's a distinct point in time in which boxing is introduced, and that's kind of unique with this process in particular.
It's also just like kind of how the flow is with like working with some of our clients. Like for Ludwig, for example, it's like a mixed bag in terms of like, oh, like we know we're gonna release collections, right? Because honestly, it's a bit more merch driven, and we know it's something that has to be meaningful to him or something that makes sense for content that he's doing. Whether at the time the idea was that he was going to do a chess stream or chess tournament or something like that, and then we would build a concept around it, right? It's like, hey, I'm doing this. Let's build something that makes sense around it on an apparel standpoint, and that's where it differs here. We're not like thinking more about like theoretical or conceptual season-based collections that are more, I guess, high level, have bigger narratives. This is more so, hey, like what's something that he likes or what's something that he's doing that we can find something that there's fit in.
Yeah, the content tie-in is equally as important as the design itself.
And right in that context, right, like that's how we arrive at, okay, we know he wants to do something chess related. So how can we build an apparel collection around the ideas and the themes of chess? And here's where we go initially, and like, hey, like there's this open space, right? Of like, usually here, like we do like this big like concept mood board, or like we're just like
We're usually
throwing.
pitching something in the sense of we're not approached with the core meat and bone, right? Like our role is to define where this fits in a calendar, but also fits conceptually. And with chess, it was unique in the sense of this was the first project that Mogul came to us with this distinct identity. So that kind of initial mood boarding phase was somewhat skipped in a way that traditionally when we're working with them, we have a little more of that direction to push. You can see with like, if you pull up geography.
Yeah, so I just want to like, geography is like another great example of like, literally Ludwig was like really into GeoGuessr, and he was like, I want to do something that's geography themed. And you can already be like, okay, like what does that mean? And I know if you've seen the collection, like there's some sort of an idea of like what that ended up turning out to be. But then like where the mood board phase and like how we start these things is just like, okay, like we've got this initial concept, if it's working like this and how it works for Ludwig, let's put as many ideas that we can even think about that are loosely related to that, so that, you know, we can just start to like synthesize of like, what can this mean and where can this arrive and what can we end up like looking and seeing what that is. So whether that's just pulling imagery from like, oh, like, you know, things that are remotely outdoorsy or things like that, or, you know, I think obviously like for us, looking at what contemporary fashion labels have done that feels adjacent to something like that, so we can start to see visually like what a capsule that's rooted in something like that could look like. So like, again, like this is usually like what we do here is first just like, you know, everyone on the creative side, like just throw as many ideas in as possible, right? Like there's no real order or structure to it. Like we'll try to put them together if we're like, oh, like this is how I went down this rabbit hole, right? And these are all things that are like more outdoorsy or camping oriented, or these are things that are more like ski oriented. And then right, it gets synthesized here. I think this is like one of the best, I guess, like examples of like how this goes into a certain place where it's like, okay, we've come up with like all these things in a mood board. How can we synthesize it to things that like actually make sense in terms of like a campaign that has a consistent direction when it comes to a narrative, right? So we were looking, for example, at a concept like a diverse world, right? Which is the name of one of the GeoGuessr categories. But then the idea of like doing 5 products that are rooted in the 5 biomes of the world. So that's one capsule, again, like more rooted in outdoors. And we had one that was called Expedition, which was just more rooted in like streetwear, that kind of like lead in those directions. You know, so, you know, again, like something that gives us a bit more design flexibility and probably something that's more design forward. And then the last one was like more the direction of what we leaned into, which was this more casual kind of like greetings from, we like obviously like the postcard element of it, more illustration driven, just like more kind of like universal, a bit warmer.
A little more retro leaning, has a little more of this kind of like old school Americana vibe to it, rather than being outdoor first. It's kind of a celebration of the outdoors, I think. So that's the difference. But as you see with the chess stuff, rather than pitching these graphic directions, we're approached with this concept of the Mogul Chess Club. How does that fit into their brand? How does that exist within the kind of full winter calendar they're looking to build? So rather than arriving at a point where we're initially pitching ideas, it's much more of pitching style. And I think you'll see throughout the mood board this kind of step towards the kind of academia infused style that we landed on, versus looking here in this kind of initial place, you can see a lot more kind of street focused silhouette.
I will also just say, right, like again, like a big thing here is just like, especially going back to this, it's just like this process just wasn't as strong, regardless of it, if it was because there was less of a focus from Ludwig's side or things like that. I think like we just hadn't developed a better way of getting that from the client, right? Like I think a part of like why you'll see this change completely, right? If you look at Design Pass 1, for example, you know, this looks nothing like what we ended up with, even outside of the idea of adding boxing to it, right? Like we tried to provide some sort of identity that felt strong, that felt more contemporary, that could kind of take it away from a lot of like maybe what's more conventionally chess in the way that we ended up bringing it towards. But I think landing in a process in a step like this, where we did a whole lot of design here, as you can tell, but it clearly didn't get used and it clearly landed flat, was a failure of how our systems worked at that time, where we wouldn't be able to present ideas strong enough before we got to this phase, right? Because in a sense, if you look at this now, we could have avoided even putting all this design work in, if we were able to show,
if you pitch this as a theme, pitch this as a style, rather than arriving straight into design.
Yeah. For example, something like how geography was, right? If you look at it, there was no core design work done even up to that point, but it helped us have the conversations, or helped us get to the point where we felt more strongly about going into design, because we knew that we had a direction that that they liked, and that they, and even if you look at, I can't even fill the gaps if this is all that was sent over, right? But if you can tell, like, any feedback from this, like, couldn't really help us land that concretely. And also I will say, right, like with this one, we were working with another freelance designer at the time, who, we had just been working with at the time. So it's also that, right? Like, I think there's the whole subject of even then, right? Like, our flow working with freelancers, even when we do, is totally different, right? And how can we arm them, considering that they won't be the person that's like in the process of talking to the client and synthesizing like what that larger direction would look like. And in a thing like this, like, probably like really just threw them into the deep end to create this identity. What do our creative briefs look like?
It's interesting with Mogul in the sense of,
yeah,
we don't receive briefs from Mogul. It's our role is to counter ideas that we've pitched with our own kind of external brief, where we'll work with Aiden, particularly on the Mogul side, to take a loose idea that's usually, as we kind of described, grounded in some form of content or media, which is either an idea that Ludwig has, or an idea that they deem as good, maybe for a show, maybe for just a wider kind of piece of Mogul branding. And our role is going out of meetings with the client. We build kind of pitches of existing styles that we want to update, or entirely new directions. So as you'll see with the geography stuff, a lot of that was grounded in the idea of GeoGuessr being really popular, Ludwig engaging with that community a lot. This was right when kind of like the rainbows of the world were popping off. We counter that with stylistic pitches, and then throughout the process of knowing that, okay, there's a hole in a calendar for a release in Q3, whatever it is, we have this idea that Ludwig feels strong about with a kind of general theme. We build counter proposals that eventually arrived at this idea of celebrating where Ludwig was from in New Hampshire, taking that as kind of like the wildlife element. So the original brief we get is kind of just verbal vibes with the client. It's a lot of communication stuff that we've built this relationship around. Whereas in this chess brief, we hadn't yet defined that process. So rather than us producing a brief to send to the client to get their approval, we were straight in the deep end of, we know they want to do something based with chess. We know there's a bunch of different styles we can explore here. You'll see this kind of first pass that's very kind of digital chess. I think, speaking to this concept of chess as live stream content. During COVID, everyone watching Queen's Gambit, taking this direction of contemporary design, applying it to chess, similarly to how kind of entertainment media was at the time. This didn't land, so then the process of refining, working with the client to build out a more compelling strategy is what led to the final set of product.
Yeah, and I think there's like an interesting thing here, right? Because like there's a gap here that exists that like I can't even really fill, because again, like part of this is just like how our Figma has been, or like how our processes have been built, have changed a bit. And again, like I wish this was documented a bit better, just so it'd be a bit easier to talk about. Hey, how did we land from, what was the feedback directly from past one that led us here? Obviously some part of this was incorporating boxing at some point. But like even then, like how that communication gone is hard. Like I can't remember. This was 2 years ago now. But I think the interesting part about this process, especially talking about this project, is this is when Felix came on and started working on this project, which is also why, in large part, a lot of like the designs changed significantly in that way as well. Obviously, like work with different people, but as you can kind of tell, the brief had kind of changed. Like we were talking a lot more about, even despite the boxing element of it, just looking at like a more dark, like academia kind of aesthetic. It was something that was quite prevalent at that time, just in general, I think in pop culture, whatever you want to call it. So we kind of like landed on this thing about like, I think it was also like really good for the juxtaposition of chess and boxing, like landing in this thing about it being, boxing being a mental sport and playing into this kind of like this interesting thing where it's boxing and it's chess, but it's like more rooted in like the academic or the more, I don't know, like formal and preppy side of things. And we thought that was like a fun lane to play into. And that's where it informed a lot of like how we then got to this. Again, like I wish there was more insight I could actually provide him to how he got here, because as you can see, there's a huge shift, and I think like the process of getting there would be pretty great to be able to talk about if I could with more certainty or confidence. But in that way, like I think it's a good time for like Felix to kind of, because again, like this is where Felix really hopped into it. So I think his insight or his at least recollection of how we got to where we got to is good and important here.
Yeah, so I think the thing that clearly stylistically changes here is the original set of designs that was produced, specifically kind of regarding Mogul branding when it came to incorporating chess as any form of identity, felt pretty cold in the sense of treating this as a canvas to explore something that felt very alien to chess, and also particularly kind of Mogul's brand being a little more personable ultimately. So introducing in this kind of slide that you're seeing now, the idea of kind of ultimately taking it back a step rather than looking forward, playing into more of the kind of like retro heritage styles, using more kind of warm fonts, playing into more iconography rather than more abstract stuff. There was the clear kind of overlap with the idea of Mogul moves as the name of the brand, but also chess moves, book moves, playing off of this idea of, well, can we explore iconography of chess that's a little more abstract, but ultimately ties directly into themes of stuff like what way can chess pieces move? Simple takes like that, where you suddenly open up a wider set of iconography that's available beyond just checkerboard or simple stuff like that, which ultimately made the brief suddenly wide open, where we could start exploring, okay, what if this is like Gothic take, where you're saying, how can we go even further back in kind of the history of this, playing into like old school Germanic styles, or leaning into the more kind of like smoking room, old school, like old folks sitting around playing chess, smoking cigars, like elevating this in a way that isn't necessarily pushing boundaries in a sense of it has to be super modern contemporary design. We can maybe play into something that feels a little more old school, a little more recognizable. Where can we draw in iconography? And then you see, yeah, this pivot where all of a sudden now we're introducing boxing elements and boxing iconography, and you have this juxtaposition between kind of brain versus brawn, and you're playing into kind of very physical aspect of this chess boxing style, but then also need to remain core to the fact that this is primarily a chess themed capsule. I think that was the most challenging thing throughout the whole process, was finding ways to blend those two things. And I think ultimately the closest we got to that and the best feeling we got was probably in the 2023 round when we were working on photo and video, and we finally hit the nail on the head with this idea of exploring the Mogul kind of like chess universe rather than being this super highbrow thing, instead kind of taking it back a level, keeping some of this heritage style, but playing into the idea of imagining it's almost like a college sport, and you have these athletes who are celebrating a win, but you're combining that with kind of like the nerdy high school chess club, and you have this crossover of, okay, we're not trying too hard to be cool, but we can still play into some of the fun iconography and some of the kind of recognizable nature of these two like legacy things. And that's where I think this kind of Mogul chess club, Mogul boxing club, separate identity that reflected the same feelings, is where this really started to hit the nail on the head. So you see this transition from very distinct ideas to all of a sudden blending something that felt like it kind of approached the two themes in a way that was successful, which is these are both highly competitive, these are both kind of championship caliber sport, but you can take elements of the two that are a little more juxtaposed and kind of bring them back together in a way that felt kind of fresh, I think. And that was fun, where you see kind of the original take with the iconography remains through, but the overall styling and theming shifted up quite drastically. And that opened routes to start playing with product that felt more in line with the kind of academia style that we were going for. So kind of the original pitch with these hard lines, these more kind of sans serif fonts, felt a little bit more kind of techy. Now you arrive in things that feel a little more warm, and you can start introducing kind of like the corduroy patches, things like that, where you're taking this design identity from this graphics, and now you can start applying it to kind of physical goods.
I think fundamentally, like, I think everyone is aware of this. It's just like, this was a difficult ask, right? It was like, how do we merge these two things that are very different? And I think like the iconography ask was always like the real difficult thing, right? Like, how can we, it was always this balance, and I think we found it, but I think, you know, there was always like, how can we find it a bit further, of like this capsule feeling very chess leaning, and us finding ways for it to still feel true to boxing in a way that made sense. And I think like that was the difficult ask, and it continued to be when we were like designing more products for it the following year, last year. The other thing I talk about process wise that's different here, also some part of like how it's presented, This was obviously incredibly identity driven just because of the difficulties of putting together the two themes. Typically, depending on the client, like we'll work differently, right? Because at the end of the day, like we've gone all the way to this point and you guys haven't seen a single piece of clothing. And I think some part of that is intentional, just in the sense of like there was a lot of identity building that we had to do first in order to get it right. But there were obviously some conversations that don't exist here from what we're showing on Figma, just in terms of like, I think we were, especially in the infancy of when we were working with Ludwig, it was one of those things where like we had to have a hoodie, you know, just in the context of merchandise.
This was their first cut and sew
Yeah,
production at all.
That was the other thing, right? In terms of this process, right? It was a really big deal for everyone involved, right? It was the first time we were working with them on a cut and sew production, right? So even just getting their buy-in of being like, hey, like this is going to be a 6 to 7 month process. You know, we're going to have to be like going through samples, and also at the same time, hey, we can be entertaining you guys to doing anything, right? Like anything is available to you, right? The corduroy patches, you know, the metal aglets, something that we'll talk about. But this was very much a new process for them. And I think, again, just coming back to it, right? Fundamentally, there was a lot of hesitancy, like even though we were going through, but it was like, hey, if we're going to do novel products, it still needs to be grounded or rooted in products that we know we can sell, frankly, right? And for anyone who's a content creator, you know, t-shirts and hoodies are the things that are just the easiest to move. So we knew that the flagship piece, no matter what we did to it, would have to be a hoodie. So in that sense, this collection in some ways had a bit less of that process. Again, like we can show it later, where, you know, when we approach any project, a lot of the big ask is part graphic and part, hey, what are the products we're actually going to pursue here? And how do they fit into the larger theme?
I think especially with Mogul, when they built a library of hoodies, right? They'd blown up with the mint hoodie. They'd released the kind of lavender version of that. They'd built a brand that was revolving very heavily around this particular piece. So they asked to take chess boxing and provide kind of a unique take on the item that they'd already built a strong foundation with, kind of informed the whole kind of product design directory, in the sense of, we knew that was going to be the staple piece of the collection. If a hoodie is your big ticket item, where do you go from there? Kind of limit some of the creativity there. So it is very much this case of building a strong identity, knowing that we have this one kind of hallmark item that has to hit. And that's different with the kind of more modern Mogul takes, simply because this first step into cut and sew opens up so many routes to produce unique items that now when you release something like the Geography collection, you don't need the iconic Mogul hoodie anymore, and you can start broadening the brand.
I think similarly, like a good way to show that evolution is that like if we pitched to do the reversible fleece that we did in 2023 this year, I don't think it would have ever made it out, right? It's just, we've evolved to that point working with Mogul moves and the yard to a point where they know that products like these can sell. There's like an elevated taste, there's trust that's been built with the audience. But here was a lot about like, hey, how can we build more stable pieces, more clean and simple pieces? A great example of that is the rugby polo, something that we all had some doubts going into, just again, as a novel product, hadn't really been done before. And there were some decisions that we made in terms of like making it a bit more simple, but a product that like sold incredibly well. So again, there's a lot of learning that happened here, and it's an interesting project to talk about in that way because it was so early on in the process.
And I think this is an interesting case where throughout this process you find this distinction between taste and kind of wearability and sellability important, where a lot of the time that we find ourselves kind of designing to a gold standard of, you know, things that we'd wear, things that we think are innovative. A lot of the time there's this balance that you have to play with client expectation, and that's something that I think people that have freelanced can understand, which is this case of, you may pitch 100 ideas that you love 50 of them, and the client may pick the 50 that you hate, and that's something you have to learn to deal with. And I think this is a particular exercise in us narrowing our kind of lens when we were designing to really focus in on kind of a subset of this idea that we felt confident with from the beginning, rather than, you know, designing 100 hoodies and arriving at a point that maybe we didn't feel that strongly about the items we were pitching. You'll see from this kind of initial design pass that a lot of the elements of the final products existed. And I think that speaks to the volume of the work we did up to this point, as much as it was very identity driven, meant that we landed with a canvas that felt.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I realize I know where this sample of this hoodie is. It's in my closet. I was complaining all day leading up to here because I wish that we had more of the samples for this collection to talk about, just to go over like what got changed and things like that. I have this hoodie, is my realization now, and I just didn't bring it. But yeah, like as you can see, like a lot of the primary designs, what have you, stayed the same. There was a lot of conversation on their end about whether they wanted to brand this as Mogul or Mogul Moves. And it's kind of seen of like what ended up being and what's gone on since is that like they've wanted to lean more into just the idea of Mogul. It obviously also made the backprint a lot less busy. But in this stage, it was a lot of just like, we had this like core idea that we knew we liked and they liked, like this space hoodie. Really early on, we pitched the idea of doing the metal drawstrings with the Aglets. So it was something that like we knew was going to happen. So it was really about like identifying, nailing down like what the actual design would be and like the identity around that. So you can see, I remember this one on the right, I think was the one we presented first actually, and it evolved into the one that we actually ended up with. And then again, like see, like we pitched it without it saying moves, for example. And that's obviously what ended up making it. But again, like, yeah, here's this alternate design that didn't see the light of day. We had some notes, as you can kind of see them.
It's this case of risk-taking for their brand, right? Where not only are we stepping into cut and sew, we're now talking about adjusting brand identity in a way that no longer says Mogul Moves. It's no longer the embroidered script that people are used to. You're taking clear stylistic decision-making that had been, I don't want to say neglected previously, but Mogul had built a brand with successful pieces, and now we're taking the kind of essence of that, and our role is to try and innovate in that in a way that feels good visually, but also sells visual. And there's an element of fear there in the sense of, if we change too much, is this becoming too kind of abstract for a merchandise audience? And I think keeping kind of identity simple, but revolving quite clearly around the theme meant that fans engaged with it really positively. And I think that particular elements of this idea of kind of academia, rather than leaning too far into, you know, making formal wear, we never wanted to alienate people, but we wanted to try and capture as much of kind of the internal essence of that theme in a way that felt fitting. You know, you can take something like a boxing robe with the large hood, taking that, transferring those ideas to something like a hoodie, and you start realizing that the parallels that exist between these two mediums, at least in kind of a fashion sense, you can start playing into in a way that felt kind of fresh. And I think that was great.
Yeah, to that point, I think another thing that's worth noting is that when we first started this project, the idea that Ludwig had actually was for it to like have the script text from the mint hoodie on the front of it with other chest elements. And it actually took a lot to convince him not to do that. But I think it's a good thing of just like how we've graduated to this point of like, yeah, like there was a point when we were first doing this that it was like, you know, as much as we want to do something that's chest related,
it's a repeat of things that were working.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, how much risk do we want to take? How much risk does Ludwig want to take in terms of, you know, producing something that is totally novel, right? He's like, if I put the script thing on it, I know I can sell it because I've done it in the past, right? So it took us a while to even get to the point here, and then obviously the point way beyond here, where we're looking at, oh, like, it's, these risks are worth taking, or, you know, like we can create things that go beyond just like, I guess, this gimmick or like this staple that's been sold or that does well in the past. And, you know, again, I think for everyone, like this collection just did really, really well, and the reception was really, really strong and helped build a good foundation for how we would continue to work from that point on and what we were able to do, right? I don't think, for example, with geography, we would be able to do the jacket how we did it if it wasn't for something like this, where we have a proof of concept that fans would respond well to, I guess, more elevated design and also to more elevated product. And then again, just speaking on like general process and how we look at these things now, is that you can kind of see how late on that we're starting to look at things like a larger creative campaign as far as it goes to Moodboard. Because one thing that I think fundamentally back then we had problems with, but we weren't approaching the right way, just with how a lot of people, if it's in the creator space or not, approach creative, especially in terms of a larger campaign as it relates to photo video or e-com or marketing, is that it really feels disconnected in that sense, right? We designed this whole collection, it's now time to market it, it's now time to shoot it. If they end up creating something that feels connected, that's great, but you can kind of tell that thought happened way later in the process.
White box studio shoots.
Exactly. Or it's the opposite, what you just said, where it's totally disconnected in that sense where Sure, the collection looks great, but then what you ended up pushing it with, right, the photo and the video, are totally disconnected, they're totally unrelated. And you can kind of tell that there was like a lack of overarching direction about like looking at it from a high level of like, hey, no, like actually the identity that we created, for example, in this case, where there were some of this work was done earlier, but just like we had this like larger vision of this like more academia vibe that kind of also merged in sports, and looking at some of these references like this Ivy Park shoot where again like they're in like this like more old school, old vintage style manner. Like there's a lot of like this bridging of the gaps between like this more about this like
it's like luxury and victory are kind of the two themes. You're celebrating success, and how do you express that physically? You can talk about kind of this lavish lifestyle, this kind of more opulent and kind of aggressively chic kind of styling. And I think that's something that, at least in the creator space at the time, felt heavily unique. In the case of a lot of shoots that you were seeing would just be renting spaces in studios and doing this kind of flat feeling photography, or even just the kind of whole creative campaign it's just alluding to. And something that we wanted to make sure we were doing here is not just designing an identity, we're building a voice where it's more than just the storytelling of these logo marks. You're starting to build an identity that goes beyond that, leading up to this massive championship. And I think that these kind of showcase this identity in a way that would have been very great. Obviously, you saw that the final shoot didn't land in this style, but this was kind of the initial ideation when we're talking about blending the kind of physical aspect of sport with the kind of, the mental aspect of it.
It's fun in that way because, like, again, we'll talk through the shoot for this one because it was really interesting in that sense, but you can kind of see, like, even though like the year prior we were looking at it in this way and we were looking at executing the shoot for last year, especially because there wasn't a physical event, we came back to this, right? Like we already always had the idea to approach the creative in that way. And it's kind of like always nice where, again, like in that same way, like a vision or direction that you had that grounded the capsule from the start still rings true a year later. And those are like the kind of decisions that we would like to make, right? Like make decisions based off of something that's overarching, right? We're not making decisions on the fly just based off of a design that gets done. We hope that there's an overarching campaign direction that informs what you do in the designs, why the clothes are what they are, why you pick certain products over other products. And that also informs your photo video, your marketing, your e-commerce, all those things should be rooted in this larger vision that starts from the beginning instead of it being this thing that just kind of like happens as it goes. And that's something that I think we're still trying to get better at, is making sure that we're looking at these things more holistically as complete and as things that are informed by one individual vision, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, we don't just be making products to sell. It's about building a voice, telling stories that go deep. I think that's fun.
Yeah. So again, I wish I had these products, and I thought I did, and it would have made this part of this a lot better. Because I think this is the cool part, right? Where you guys only ever see the finished products. And I think it's like always really interesting, even for us, right? I think the most exciting part of the job period is getting samples in, right? You've been seeing all this stuff, all this work up to this point has just been like designing things on a screen. And you know it's gonna end up being a physical product, but like once you actually get that in and realize decisions that you make actually like end up making a difference and an impact, I think same goes for the client, right? Like they're, hey, like we want this to be a bit longer, we want this to be a bit shorter, or we want there to be pockets or things like that. And as people who, you know, obviously that's not their primary discipline, and usually merch for them is just like approving a graphic on a t-shirt. This is a really cool part of the process where they can kind of feel like, oh wait, hey, actually decisions that I make affect things.
Yeah.
And I think that's very exciting.
And you're building an intuition for something new, right? Whereas it's difficult to visualize a lot of these things when they're digital, but you start to see things in a physical space, you can start to make decisions on texture and finish and feel. And those are things that are exciting for a client in particular, like Ludwig, who had only ever, ordered independent hoodies on a website in a color, printed a logo on them, and then shipped it, whether that's print on demand, whether that's buying a volume beforehand. But something like this, he's now able to see the work that goes into making these things. And I see there's a comment in the chat about how do you find the blanks that you use? And this is the conversation of, this was Mogul's first cut and sew product. So everything we're building here is from scratch, which they'd never experienced.
Yeah, and I think to that point, right, just addressing it, right, I think there's that unique balance, and just speaking on it really quickly about the idea of going cut and sew versus using blanks, right? And I think we obviously, like initially when we approached this capsule, when we were talking about them, there probably was a point where it was like, hey, why don't we just go with blanks, right? It'll be quicker. I wouldn't say it'd be cheaper is the interesting thing here, especially if you're using a quality blank. But here you have a product that ended up being what it was because we chose to go down that route, right? You know, like the ability to have these sewn elbow patches be a part of the actual construction of the good, and that way you wouldn't have to worry about applying on a finished good and worrying about, you know, warping or wrapping or anything like that.
Or even just like the longevity of the product, right? When
Yeah.
you're able to make these decisions in the fabrication process, you're not going to get the problem, ideally, of, you know, a fan washes their hoodie and it falls apart immediately.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to make these decisions and do the actual like R&D testing prior to selling the product, and that's kind of the gold standard ideal way to be.
And the big selling point for this one was obviously the drawstrings, right? And we found actually like it's a process that's incredibly difficult, especially like stringing them and things like that. People have been like talking about how to get replacements, but again, something that was available to us because we approach it in this way, right? If we were to find a blank like an LA Apparel or something like that, obviously that hoodie's not going to have those drawstrings. It's something that we had to make custom and had to mold the pieces themselves.
And then you're talking cost of applying those to a blank. This hoodie, a big important factor in building this whole collection, and kind of with every streamer collection as you'd imagine, is making sure that the price point this hits at isn't too aggressive. So adding all of these fun bells and whistles to an existing product that's already, we're talking made in Los Angeles, buying blanks that are coming from the US, you're talking that already is sold at a premium, then you're applying all of these additional things. The client's going to see a bill at the end and freak out.
Yeah. How do you determine where a product deserves to be unsewn? How do you determine when to stop learning customer? Yeah, I think that's a great question, because to that point, I was going to speak like not every collection that we do, most of them now are unsewn, but we still do work with some
Domestic
blanks.
vendors, yeah.
And I think that's an important thing and has been consistently for us. When we started this, my intent was to never do anything domestically, right? Never do anything with blanks, because fundamentally it was like, hey, if we're starting a business to kind of do things better than everyone else, for lack of a better way to put it,
to make a perfect product. Yeah.
then our differentiation is to do custom cut-and-sew products, right? To do things that we believe that other agencies can't do, that when we launch with a creator like Ludwig, for example, his stuff will stand against everyone else's because everyone else's are the same, right? They're all just on hoodies or t-shirts. But you know, we've had situations, for example, we've done a collection like initial collection for Mogul Winter, or
Strike off pieces here and there.
strike out pieces here and there, or Mogul Munchies, for example, or something we'll talk about here is that we also actually still do all of their t-shirts domestically on domestically available blanks. We've just found that we like the quality of t-shirts better, and it's just good to have the flexibility to work here and to be quick with how revisions go. But on the subject of blanks, for us, it's like when we find the situations where we have certain blanks that we have vetted, that we like, that we think are quality. And that's how we set that barometer, is that if a client is looking to do something domestically, okay, first evaluate if that's something that makes sense and aligns for us in terms of what they're looking to do. And then secondary, do they align with the price point that exists to hit blanks of a quality that we're okay with putting our time behind? Because if it's not, right, if they're like, hey, we want to hit a certain price point, we want to use a independent hoodie, for example, you know, those are typically things we don't touch, right? Because once we're talking about working with a blank of that quality, we're starting to talk about undermining what we feel like we do as a business. But yeah, just to come back again, like we've done work to vet like a whole bunch of different vendors and a bunch of different blanks that are blanks that we feel confident or comfortable using. And that's how we've arrived at that point. And I think like going on, like we'll keep talking about this about like how we know when we're done sampling and things like that.
I think there's a big thing kind of tying back to that question of when a product deserves to be cut and sew. A lot of it comes down to fit and finish, where when you're talking about streamer merchandise, a lot of the decisions that you're making regarding how a product fits on your body, most creators are looking for quite standard kind of garments, which opens the kind of opportunity to use blanks a little wider. When you start working with clients who are interested in kind of expressing themselves a little bit more through the clothes themselves, that's much harder to do when you're limited to using blanks that someone else has already designed. If you want to make adjustments to how long something is in the body or how the shoulder sits, things like that, you can't do with domestic blanks. So a lot of it comes down to not just how custom the product is, but also kind of the ethos of why the product is being made in the first place. Where you can print these graphics, but we wanted to do them with this kind of textured blocking feel so that it kind of elevates it a little bit further. And these are things that just become available to you when you kind of find manufacturers that you trust, people that you feel like you can make great products with, because ultimately, whenever we approach a product, we want to make the best version of the thing possible. And with something like a t-shirt for Ludwig, does it make sense to do this as a cut and sew good? What are the things we're actually going to be changing about the existing block? We're probably pretty happy with how the blank t-shirt fits and feels. We know that the blank t-shirt we can produce with a quicker timeline because it's not going to ship around the world. All of these things kind of need to be balanced out piece by piece, client by client, and with something like chess, it really felt like the only way to achieve this in a way that felt compelling was this split of blank to cut and sew, where the t-shirts, we have full customization on the colors, things like that, all the applications, but we're not reinventing the wheel. There's no need to kind of step too far beyond. It's kind of already there.
So just to speak about like how like this being a first sample and how this process goes, right? Like the most kind of like obvious things. I mean, it's not obvious without seeing this one in person, but we got this one and the neck hole was so small you couldn't really put your head in.
Yeah,
so
that's like a medium large body with like an extra small neck hole. It was pretty aggressive.
So again, like why sampling is important, because you know you catch things like this, and why again in this process where you're creating customized goods, problems like this arise because again this is totally made custom, right?
Yeah, I think
so
there's
issues like this can come up, and they allow for us to flag them, and also allow. I think the great thing for us getting these products in and also showing them to clients is like, again, showing decisions that they make coming out in a physical form, but then involving them in the process of being able to continue to make adjustments on real physical product, where we'll pursue a second sample. And to Hendrik's point, we'll do 2 samples, and usually that's informed both by cost and by time, because obviously the more samples we produce, the more that costs. The more samples we produce, the more time it takes, right? So typically that's how we operate. But just on the second point, the thing that's like the most obvious to see is you can just kind of see the color difference. This is the most immediate flag, was like, hey, like we have this like significant color difference between the corduroy patches and the felt print, right? And this is an interesting one, right? Because with the elbow patches, you know, you're looking at sourcing available fabric, right? So that color is the color. So then we're looking at, hey, we want to match the flocking print to the elbow patch, right? And then not what I want to press. But here we have the finished sample, for example, and you can see that it's not perfect, but we found a much closer match to be able to find fabric available that matches on both sides. So again, this is just the show, just like in the context of sampling and what we're looking to accomplish and achieve. That's the big one, right? Like we find things to flag and we produce another sample, and largely the big goal is that when we produce a second sample, which we're kind of saying now is the last sample, is that we're coming as close to final production. Because if we're making wholesale changes in production that we're not going to see in person, there's a lot of fear, obviously.
It's the intuition aspect of this.
So typically we're looking to address all major changes and get a second sample that's as close as possible, and we'll still make some minor changes, but usually we're going to production with a sample that's as close as possible. If not, then we'll be talking about producing a third sample, just because we need to make sure that we have the confidence of like what we're actually producing in mass is quality.
When you're committing to thousands of units without seeing them, there's the element of ghost in the room changes that even looking at this first sample, right, we can provide measurements that feel reasonable for something like the neck of the polo shirt, but then you have to think about the fact that this polo is actually corduroy. So that material is going to wash differently. It's going to shrink differently to the rest of the garment when they're applying dyes and things like that. So these are decisions that you often run into, these kind of like unexpected problem-solving elements. Something like the chest club hoodie, where you run into this case of, even in some cases we've had where we can get fabric custom dyed, but if we're going to do a sample, that needs to be on available fabric. So then you're making color decisions that you're not going to see until the final production run. But you can make all of the design decisions up to that and kind of trust in your manufacturer that they're going to do a good job. And that's the great thing about working with the same manufacturers all the time, is that you build these relationships with them in a way that it becomes more meaningful.
And just because we talked about it quickly, like we actually did sample these t-shirts as cut and sew products overseas. And we actually just ended up finding that the existing domestic Los Angeles-based t-shirts, we just all had a stronger preference for. You can kind of see even just with the weight of the tees, they were really light and things like that. So this is actually a decision that we've since now all of the Mogul t-shirts and the Yard t-shirts are off the same body, off the same blank. And this decision actually happened here. When we tried to do a t-shirt overseas, we didn't like it, and we found out that the block that we have existing in LA was better and of more preference. So that's basically how that decision ended up happening.
Yeah, and of course we can produce a t-shirt that's better overseas, but then you're introducing a longer timeline to that sampling process. So for example, if we wanted to follow through with the double-headed night t-shirt top left, but we want to make large scale changes, even to something like material weight, if we're talking upgrading the physical weight of the cotton that we're using, that's a very significant change to the sample. So if we're talking adding an additional month to a timeline versus doing a domestic sample can be done. So it's just a conversation of balancing quality versus time.
So I think this next one is like the one that like kind of interested people the most, right? Like we really early had this concept of doing metal drawstrings. I think we had this even before we were talking about doing chess specifically, about just like the idea of it being cool. And then chess came up and we're like, okay, if we had metal drawstrings, what if we made the Aglets a king and a queen? And really the idea behind it doesn't go as far as like that was just, it's just really cool. And I still continue to this day to think that it is very cool. So in this process, it was really just about, for us, it was interesting because we were looking at doing custom molded hardware and trying to find an understanding of what size would make sense.
Understanding the durability aspect of these pieces both have very fine, and so you either have the kind of spherical element of the queen or the cross.
What's up, Gatsby?
And that's hitting this in a scale that felt reasonable without being overwhelming, but also having substantial weight to it so that it doesn't feel like a super cheap metal element. It's the balance where it's like almost like attaching jewelry to a hoodie, and that's something that you see kind of across the board. A lot of brands do. Arriving with something like this where it's very themed was a unique take. And we'd obviously played with a bunch of different chess iconography throughout the whole set. You see, like the knight is the piece that we felt best represented the collection visually, in the sense of you're taking the kind of most innately physical element for chessboard, and that's obviously got direct ties to boxing when I talk about action sport. But with something like two pieces of Aglets on a hoodie, it felt like king and queen are the obvious choice. You're taking the most iconic pieces of chess.
It was an interesting balancing act because we wanted them to be relatively small because they're going to be dangling, they're going to be weighing down the hood, they're going to be clanking against each other. So the bigger they are, the more obnoxious it is as a design element. I think like we wanted it to be a nice part of the hoodie.
It's going to be wearable.
Yeah, but we didn't want it to be like, oh my God, you have two giant chess pieces on you.
Yeah.
And it didn't have to be something that like, oh, every time I put this on, it's like, I'm making this crazy statement. And I think we landed at a good point, but it was like, hey, there's a balancing act of creating a piece that was big enough to be readable, big enough to be able to be attached to the chain in a strong way, which if you have the hoodie, you don't have the hoodie, and I'll say it now. We had issues with the one last year. The connection point wasn't as strong as it could have been, and 2 years ago. And it did break for some people. So last year we actually improved the connection. So the hoodie from 2022 and 2023 is slightly different. And the only difference is actually that we improved.
I think the chain's slightly thicker too.
Yeah. So we improved the chain and we improved the connection point of the chess pieces themselves just to increase the durability. And you can kind of even see here some decisions that we made. Like initially we had one that were hollow and we wanted them to be filled.
Felt super lightweight. It doesn't really feel like it's hitting that jewelry feel at all. It would float around as you walked way too heavily. It needed to be grounded in something that felt more substantial. And then even here talking about size changes, where you have the step you're going from hollow to physical, where it's fully filled in, the entire thing's metal. Then you're taking the decision that, okay, now it's too heavy. And then simple things like the color of the silver being too washed out, the color of silver being too bright. You're making these decisions based off of multiple steps in the sample.
Yeah, and again, I think this is something that like through work and through kind of going through this process, I think we landed in a place where I think it ended up being really strong. I think the sizing was great. And again, it's just like a process of sampling and getting these things right. But just like in terms of like the overall like initial intention for this, I think like, it came really early on and we knew this is something that we wanted to do, especially in the context of, we know we're going to do a hoodie. How are we going to make it special? It was like, we want to do the quarter elbow patches, we want to do felt print, and we want to do the drawstrings. Like those are things that we identified really early on. And at that point it was good in that sense, because like, oh, we know we just need to get these things right in terms of making this product special. And I think in that way we did. I have the slide and it's literally
domestic tee.
Here you go. These tees ended up being on domestic t-shirts. I don't have what the photos of the second round of samples are, but to my knowledge and my recollection of it, our second sample came back really close to what ended up being final. If anything,
really just color decisions, dropping the black.
And changing the marks, I think was the big thing. So again, like here's like how, like again, not much new, but we played with a lot of different marks that could work. They had all sorts of different issues with the marks. I think you could have seen on one of the samples, like we had sampled this like double that they ended up not liking.
Parasocial Chess Club.
Yeah, we sampled
bit on the nose.
Parasocial Chess Club. You can also see that we initially talked about doing 2 rooks too.
Yeah, I think it was the idea of we wanted to make sure that these didn't feel too long.
We were worried about the molds actually coming out,
Yeah.
right? Because the chest, the king and the queen were so complex, and this would be the easiest thing to ask for a mold of.
Yeah. But then interestingly, I think that the level of detail on the boxing gloves actually came out perhaps even more kind of impressive than the chest pieces themselves. I think most people probably preferred the chest hoodie based on the colorway, but the actual molds on the boxing hoodie were very clean from kind of the get-go, which was exciting.
This is the interesting one because this is the mark that made it all the way. All the samples were done with this.
6 months of this design.
And then it got dropped completely. If you look at the final products, it's just the Mogul text. We played with this idea of like the hand picking up the knight. But then, you know, I agree. In small sizes, the legibility got worse and worse. And that was like a constant balancing act. And then we came back to this idea of like Ludwig just like wanting to prioritize the idea of Mogul being the strong branding point. You know, I think
also conceptually having pieces that were entirely chest branded felt like it was a bit of a statement.
Yes.
We arrived in the second year of this product with obviously the pieces that start to blend the two a little closer, but here it was very much cases of having a product stack that is very distinctly chest, boxing, nothing that really bridged the gap.
So yeah, as you can see, as we're getting closer, like this mark still stands, or like we tried to like do a boxing one, because that was our whole idea, right? As it ended up coming, one was chest and one was boxing, so the front can reflect those things. And then we wanted then for the
some form of iconography that blends the two.
Yeah, the rugby polo to show both,
yeah.
Right? Because then it's like then it makes sense. There's this uniform, and then you have a boxing T-shirt and a chest T-shirt, and that was really. And then again, you can look at where the Aglets, the idea of the Aglets come in, and then we get closer and closer, and then we come to a point where, again, like the call ended up being to drop it completely. Which is like what ends up being reflected in the final product. And you can see again, like this one ended up also being reduced to Mogul, which I think it was funny at the time. I think we definitely had reservations because it was like, if you look at it now, all three of these pieces have the exact same front, which for us at the time was like, oh, this feels kind of like...
it's a little bit disappointing, but ultimately you see from a branding standpoint that as much as these pieces, at least the cut and sew goods, have these impressive elements of elevation beyond existing Mogul products, it still needed to feel like quite a merchandise grounded capsule.
Yeah, and here's a bunch of graveyard content of packaging that we are working on. These designs ended up finding their way onto a tote bag that we gave out at the event, and I think only at the event.
At some point this whole product obviously shifted to not just being chess and not just to now having boxing involved, but also having a huge live event associated with it. It's the small tote bag and the big tote bag.
Yeah. So we ended up doing two tote bags. We wanted to create like something that was special to the physical experience. So something that could be like given away. And something that makes like it different from like when you purchase online versus when you purchase at the event itself.
And obviously when it comes to the conversation of packaging, when you're now shipping thousands of units of clothes to a stadium in LA, it no longer makes as much sense to then send every order with the box online, because a large portion of sales were done in person for this event, so that comes with its own set of logistics rather than just defaulting to the classic e-commerce first experience.
And I think we didn't even talk about it, right? Like this whole thing was like for this physical chess boxing event, and I think it made that part that much more special, because I think a lot of collections that we've done since, like we haven't had that, and I think it was like pursuing things of this level are always easier and always better when there's a physical touch point, because as much as we can talk here and sit here about like how these things are really nice or what have you, being able to see them before you make that person's decision, being able to feel them, I think is always like the thing that carries it further, that much further.
Especially as a fan, when you're looking at a website that's just images of clothes and you're looking at spending significant amounts of money, it's like an obvious thing of being able to see these products in person makes it different.
Yeah, and I think this takes us, like we had this general conversation, but as the one who was kind of like trying to figure out how we were going to approach this creatively, there was this huge thing about like, how the hell do we capture chess and boxing in the same format, right? I think there was a version of it that we did last year that was a bit more simplistic in execution, but in terms of like the work that we put into this, we're like, hey, like let's find the way to actually do that, right? But then you're like, okay, the easiest way for me to do that is to put a boxing ring inside of a manor, which becomes very, very expensive and all these things like that. So I want to read this question.
Comment from Hendrik about if there was concern that the atmosphere of the event didn't tonally match the aesthetic and identity of the product.
This is an interesting question because someone asked us on Twitter, in part, and I think I'll address it on Go to 23, about how, despite the fact that we did all this design work for the collection itself and kind of in some ways feel like branding the whole idea of it, we didn't work on the branding for this event or the year after, actually. So yeah, there was a huge disconnect. And if I'm answering the question honestly, like, does that bother me, or did it feel kind of like it was like two different things despite the fact that they're the same thing? Yeah, 100%. I think in an ideal world, right, like we would have had a bit more control on that, or not control, I think a bit more ability to help on that front, so we could create something that was consistent. To that point, for people who do or don't know, like, and if it would have happened last year, George Nowak, who was at Mogul Moves at the time, worked on the identity and the graphics for last year's, and obviously given that
went pretty far in the process.
Yeah, we gave the assets that we had worked on up to that point.
This would have been the primary branding.
There was that level of consistency that would have helped in that sense.
The 2023 version of this event would have used all of the marks that were produced for the 2022 version on our side. But I do think there's an element to this that goes beyond that, though, in the sense of the work that we're doing here is building a universe that goes beyond the event itself.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think that's something that, as much as when you're there in person, you're seeing the stuff on screen feel very different to the things that people are wearing. Ultimately, there's 10,000 people in the crowd and a lot of them are wearing the merch. So all of a sudden it feels like it's more grounded. And it builds this into a legacy that goes beyond this.
I was going to say, I think the other great thing is that it doesn't feel like it's just a moment in time where it's like, oh, everything's rooted in this moment that exists in 2022, in December, you know, like has Andrea Botes on the back type thing like that. It's like, oh, we could create something that like lives above that and is a bit more timeless in that sense.
I think the parallel I see is something like you go to a concert and the merch that's available to purchase doesn't necessarily match the visual theme of the album that's just released, or even just the visuals that are showing on the stage. You have this element of this brand exists beyond the space that you're in right now. And I think that's something that's unique somewhat to the influencer space when it comes to this particular collection. In the case of the simplest thing to do here is produce merch that is directly branded with everything that people are seeing on the stream and everything that people are seeing in the arena. Building an IP that kind of extends beyond that gives it a little more focus that can stand.
Yeah, I think again, it's about finding the balance, and you could argue, and I would say the same thing, where maybe it didn't exist for this event, where, you know, like again, like we didn't work at all on the branding for it, and it was very different. But I think in that same way, it helps in some sense that they can stand alone. And I think in a funny way also, it's like, oh, like our products or the branding that we did is that much stronger because of that difference, and whether that's good or bad, in a sense of, oh, I can say it's good because it helps the product stand out, but you can also say it's bad because maybe they should exist more in parallel.
And it's an idea that we did with the Mogul Money Live stuff too, right? When you're talking about just into that kind of Mogul munchies coming through to this, we were extending this idea of selling something at a large event that isn't necessarily branded as that. Exactly.
And to the point, because Joe's asking it, and again, like someone asked on Twitter, so I'm just talking through last year's process, right? George got hired by Ludwig to work on Mogul Moves, so he was working on the branding for
Alicia and all of the kind of live event content up to that, and then chessboxing. Working quietly in the background before anything was confirmed. Everyone on the team starts working on building towards the kind of Redux V2 version of chessboxing.
Yeah, so to that point, right, the tweet was asking like, oh, hey, how much were we involved in that, right? Because with what came out, obviously it was the same logos, the design from the t-shirt and things like that. So in that way, right, like we handed over those assets and George was able to take them on. It was still not something that we were involved in. And I think the easiest way to answer that question is like, okay, like, yeah, like we would like to be involved in a way of like, we're working on something, we can like ensure a level of consistency and ensure a level of quality. But fundamentally, right, like our business with Ludwig kind of in some sense starts and finishes as things pertain to apparel. Now we're talking about branding an event. So, you know, it just kind of like exists outside of our jurisdiction. It's in our best interest in what we did to provide as much assistance or provide as much transparency into what we do and the assets that we're building, which is what we did, because
it's about supporting in everything we can.
And it also comes back to what Hendrik was saying about like providing this level of consistency that helps both. But in terms of like us being the ones who actually produce it, at a certain point, just given what our relationship is, it just doesn't really make sense. But yeah, back on the creative, we honestly, in my sense, like really like lucked out in a way. We found this venue that was like in a warehouse space that had a boxing ring in it.
It's quite a well-known venue. You see, if you go in Peerspace, you know, this is like it's not a hidden gem, but it was one that felt like it was very on theme, where we knew that the chess boxing event was going to be a little bit scuffed. It's not going to be like a, you know, world championship title fight. We have a bit of room here to play with the storytelling of this being a little bit more of like a bootleg thing. Chess boxing hadn't really been a mainstream event, so we can talk about kind of this little bit kind of like hillbilly, kind of getting into chess and boxing rather than necessarily this elite competitor who's arriving to win a war.
And honestly, like, if we didn't find this venue, I wasn't sure what we were actually gonna do. This whole shoot turned around in 2 weeks. Like, it was crazy to put together.
Quick time.
But yeah, like, again, the beauty of finding a good venue and like having like the venue be able to kind of like carry a lot of that weight and like kind of like, you know, you don't have to do too much around it because the venue just has a lot of character in itself, right? And just going into like how we work on photo video, it's changed a bit, right? But like we pitch an initial concept, right? Just the idea of having a chessboard in the ring. Who produced the event? At the time,
BTS was still kind of alive at the time.
yeah, at the time I think they worked with someone that did boxing events.
Well, they had to get some form of sanctioning, right?
Yes, they also had to do that.
The guy who commentated the event was one of the most kind of in the chess boxing community people like on earth. He's someone who's won titles in chess boxing, has hosted previous chess boxing events. So this was something that Mogul did collaboratively with kind of external parties.
Yeah, I think if I remember that one was produced by a third party, and I imagine last year's would have been like produced by a third party in tandem with off-brand. But yeah, like we had this concept of just like, hey, how do we merge the two? Like chess boxing is traditionally played with the chessboard in a boxing ring. There's your juxtaposition. You can have like this idea of academics and chess boxing juxtaposed with the boxing ring, and in our great case, like this like backdrop of like it being really grungy in this warehouse, and there you get those two elements already just off the bat.
It's this like brain versus brawn aesthetic. Whether or not you have someone sat in front of a chessboard or not, you can have this contrast between the aggression of the environment and the kind of beauty of the game, whether that's chess being played in this kind of mind sport or even kind of the dance of boxing. You can start playing into the themes that exist between both of those sports, putting it in an environment that feels visually pretty striking.
So then this just basically got us to a point. We work with an incredible photographer. His name is Jason Palacio. Also shout out if Caspi is still in here, because Caspi ended up cutting the video for this. But yeah, like we ended up creating like this great scene, like sourcing this table and getting the chessboard. We should have sourced a better quality chessboard, I know. But yeah, just being able, even like with the products themselves, right? Like, you know, this guy wearing a rugby polo, like in the context of a boxing ring, and getting like, you know, people playing chess boxing, this idea of like the shadow boxing of like, you know, you playing the move on the board, it's like taking a punch or something like that. Or even just like, you know, we had a lot of shots that we want to do of like, you know, people being coached, things like that. Or, you know, kind of like this mid-round where, you know, you have the coaches and the trainers like kind of like wiping the sweat off the brow or like cleaning up the cuts and things like that, but he's like actually in front of a chessboard, you know?
It's all about, the stylistic contrast. And I think that's what made the shoot feel fun, is that it isn't necessarily lighthearted, but elements of it feel so surreal that you're arriving at a point that it's clearly not just a traditional photo shoot. And I think that's very fun.
I mean, at the end of the day, it was really fun. I think the shoot was really well received. I wonder if there's anything else last I can just talk about. But yeah, like if we see like basically like how the Aglets and things ended up and things like that, but there was like a lot of attention to detail here that I think like ended up paying off a lot, and there was a lot of risk taken here, again, given on both on their side. It was their first console collection. The hoodies ended up selling for like quite a premium for them. I think like you look at it now, or we look at it, right? I think the hoodie was $72. If you consider like what the hoodie is, and if you shop anywhere else, literally period, it's an incredible deal. But you know, for them, right, it's like, hey, we're used to selling a hoodie at $50, right? Despite all these things, it's you never know if people will pay that money. But lo and behold, right, I think this thing sold in like 5 minutes, and you know, we've restocked it like twice or whatever since. So I mean, again, just a great kind of exercise of just going through this whole process together, and then like kind of taking the learnings, and it's informed a lot of the work that we've done since. The other thing we can like touch on really quickly was just the e-commerce work and how it ended up going. You know, we wanted to create an experience that like really lived and felt like on a chessboard. You know, we had this concept of like you click this knight and it moves like a knight behaves on the grid, and everything's grid based, kind of like a chessboard. You know,
it's like the chessboard dissolves into.
We do not. We work with a studio called Social Trust. They do all of our flat photography, which I think is the right thing to do. I can sit here for days and list off 500 people who do really terrible flat photography.
It's also the cost of using external studio for that is.
They're also incredibly affordable. That's why I'm like,
and
anyone
great
who does
people,
it,
and
yes.
it's just, you know, it's a simple case of if we were to hire a full-time photographer to work on all of these things, we'd also need to just produce so many goods for it to be worth it. When you're a brand making huge seasonal collections, I think of that being ultimately probably more cost effective. But in the way that we operate, we have a trusted kind of team that we work with. They're always great. We're able to make a lot of kind of unique stylistic decisions, and their track record's proven. They don't just work with us. There's a lot of other, you know, teams and people in the space who use the same vendor. We probably shouldn't name, but they're just great. And
yeah, I think because our process is simple in that sense, right? Where it's like on e-commerce, you're greeted with flat photography, right? And then we have editorial style photography. And what that allows us to do is that in our editorial photography, we don't have to worry as much about showing product like as clear and everything like that. We can just focus on taking good photos.
Do everything well.
Because if you really want to see the product, we have flats, we have detail photos and things like that. So that's our flow. But also in that sense like that, I'll say this again, like I was gonna name drop, but just like it's in an age where people are buying things online, your product photography is everything. It's the only way people see if it's good or not. They can't feel it, they can't touch it. Having good product photography is so important. And it's crazy to me that it ends up being such an afterthought. Right? You see sometimes like there's not even a photo of the back or whatever it might be. Like it's crazy, right? Like again, like my only ability to see your product is through this photo. And the fact that there's no level of care or detail in that ends up being incredibly detrimental, even just not me being judgmental.
I think it's especially important with a collection like this, which is their first step into cut and sew. The prices were slightly higher. You're saying we have to build good faith with an audience. They need to know that what they see is what they get. And I think that you can find a lot of examples of previous merchandise collections where fans haven't been that happy with products that have been released by other creators, other vendors, whatever it is. It's important that whatever they can see, it's clear, it's concise, there's no fluff. If they want to see great photos of people wearing them, there's fun editorial photo that does that. Flats are king.
So just, damn, we've been going for like an hour, but we're at the tail end. We can talk about last year. I mean, obviously, you know, you don't know, but this is all under the guise that they were going to run the event again.
Yeah, so we started working on all of this in March of 23, under the impression that there was going to be an event in December.
And the idea was, again, that the hoodie and the rugby polo had sold so well, and they had no opportunity to restock it, that they're like, why don't we just reorder it? People are going to want it. Like, we saw the demand. So we were basically looking at this, like, how can we find... Shit, am I leaking stuff? I am. How can we... Yeah, there's 4 people in here. Anyways, but basically, like, the idea was that we have 3 products that we like, right? The 2 hoodies and the rugby polo. We're likely going to do another t-shirt, which is something that we did do. So we already have 4 products, right? So
it's a refresh rather than a re-release.
Yeah, if the golden number that we usually look at is 5 or 6, then we're looking at doing 2 products that are new, and they should be novel, right? They should be things that exist in a space that differentiate enough from the products that exist, that are also strong enough that people will want to purchase them, which is why you look at here, right? Like, really, this is like us ideating on like what feels like it still exists in that lane, right? Of like this academic, like looking at these tones and things like that, that could fit in with the rest of the capsule, right? Also looking at things that...
There's another one here of, obviously, this is looking to land in a full winter window. So a lot of outerwear, room for more knitwear.
We knew we wanted to do an accessory, which if you saw, you didn't see, and people, you can click through a VOD if you really care now, but we knew we wanted to do an accessory, right? It was like 5 products and accessory feels good. We also like the idea of you go to an event and you can purchase an accessory. There's a chance that the accessory is meant to be event only, but I can't remember. But here you kind of see, and we're looking again at like approaching like design and like the idea of chess and things like that. You know, we really like the idea of the scarf because it's obviously inherently very academic leaning.
It also has the sport crossover. You have fans in the stand who, you know, show their team pride with scarves, things like that. It feels like
we were looking at jewelry.
Intersection.
Did we do jewelry? Who knows?
Streets will know, man.
But yeah, obviously here's like basically again like back to like how this goes and like again like how there's more of a process now, right? We were talking about the project and what we just mentioned about how we're just looking to add products to the mix and find things that make sense. and then like looking holistically like products that might make sense. So we really early were looking at the idea of doing a reversible jacket, whether that's this that we didn't do. It's more of like a cord, playing again on the fact that everything else in the collection is cord.
And also, yeah, the contrast collar to line up with the polo shirt, having the contrast collar, things like that.
Doing the reversible fleece, which is what we did. Doing a overshirt because I really like this thing.
Also something that lines in quite neatly with
Yeah.
The kind of preppier take and stuff.
Doing a cardigan.
Quest to make a streamer cardigan continues.
It's continuing.
It's continuing.
The scarf we mentioned, again, accessories, scarves, rugs, jewelry, just things that we could do that could add a bit of flair to the collection. And given that we were re-releasing so many products, how could we still create the same kind of like level of interest or like mystique around it, I guess. I don't know why
you have an IP that people are into, people resonate with as well. How do you go from this to elevate beyond successful products? And I think that's something where the fleece that you see the release, and this is also kind of sample version, we have the ability to play with iconography in a way now that's a little more free. You're not necessarily setting the kind of tone anymore. The baseline is kind of set. Now you get to play with some kind of a little more elevated take, which is fun.
So the big thing with the fleece and why we landed there and why it made sense was that we knew, like with the graphic fleece, especially for the audience, that it was a bit much. So the beauty of doing it reversible and why we approached it the way was that we could make one side plain, right? So you could wear it if you wanted to wear it that way, and it just becomes a basic, simple jacket that people don't even need to see the inside. If you're someone who's a bit more reserved with how you dress, this jacket could still be for you, or you could make those choices. Similarly, because one side's a polygon thing, you could wear the fleece and it could still be somewhat waterproof on one side, and you could still wear it.
I think this is one that landed neatly with kind of Trend too. I think this was right around the time that you were seeing a lot of streetwear brands releasing fleeces. So we were lining up with this design influence of the average person is going to start seeing these a lot more this year. Getting this in people's hands before it blows up is a good comment. And yeah, I think this was like Stussy 8 Ball Fleece was about to go crazy on TikTok kind of vibe.
And you can kind of see like we were already looking at like how do these products fit with everything else, right? We want to create products that make sense and that align with everything like that. It doesn't feel like, oh, they added the piece, but it's very much just like a new piece in isolation. Yeah. It should feel like, and the idea was for it to feel like a cohesive part of the collection. And then something else that you're seeing is this fleece for the first time, which we did sample and does exist. I just don't know where it is, and I wish I could show you. But the idea here was like, like one that's incredibly loud, and then one was the final version, which was like a bit more reserved in that sense in terms of the graphic. I am such a big fan of the one that we did end up producing, but they wanted to create something that was still wearable, which is fine. And I've heard a lot of people tell me that they really like it, so it can't be said that it was the wrong decision.
And obviously the thing that's unique here that we haven't discussed yet is the real goal with introducing new products was to provide products that blended chess and boxing, because the baseline set goods with the polo and the hoodies, they were very unique in the sense of one was chess, one was boxing. So providing a kind of high ticket item that blended the two with the kind of guise of, oh, what if someone already owns a hoodie? You can start to make this IP extend beyond the kind of core set of items in something that feels more like overly holistic, which was, I think, something we met quite neatly with this product. And you'll see that there's a bunch of colorways. Everything is this idea of blending existing.
Yeah, so in that thing, here is a photo of this
floor going crazy.
Of the fleece that didn't get released. I think it's great. I wish we ended up moving forward with it.
We had some comments. Obviously, this would have gone through additional rounds of sampling. This is just the first sample of all of these things.
But just like, again, speaking on sampling, right? Like this sample came out really strong, I will say. Like our comments for this, I don't think we had comments on fit period.
No, yeah, fit and finish here was great.
Is incredible. We had like some comments on piling, which just like in terms of just like the pile of the fleece itself.
And I would have loved the comment of making these black lines embroidery would have made this thing so.
But the biggest comment that we had, which I do have both editions of.
Spot the difference.
But let me do this. But basically, look at the embroidery. You can kind of basically tell.
This guy is a big guy. This got a big old bishop coming in crazy. The comments were that graphics need to be obviously overtly readable. The boxing glove gets incredibly lost on this version here. And when you're talking about a product that needs to blend both of these themes together, it's important that it's quite clear.
Yeah. Anyway.
That's the one to say. Yeah, reversible side of that stays exactly the same. All the fit and finish was identical. This was really just a case of adjusting artwork and getting it out the door. I think this actually maybe only needed a single sample. I think we were then content with making a purchase order based off of the edits, where it would just simply be changing the size of the graphic.
I can show this. If you look, it's actually
The
incredibly
mock-up
different.
versus real life.
It is incredibly different, and an adjustment that we made, not nearly as aggressive still as what this ended up being. But as you can see, like some of the legibility there was issues with because of how it ended up coming out in the sample. But again, just like one of those things about just like why it's important to sample.
It's also a case of it's an important one to design through a size curve as well, because obviously different size garments use different amounts of fabric. So the back panel on an extra large fleece is obviously going to be very different from the back panel on a small fleece. So if you think that the graphic fits badly in this example here, we normally sample to a medium. So you need to play with making decisions that fit all of your size curve, because a fan isn't just going to buy the size that you wear. So it's important that when we were working on particularly artwork sizing with something like a fashion fleece, that the decisions you're making aren't too drastic either one way or the other, where an extra large would look tiny, small would look.
So you can see it. We did do jewelry. You could see it. You could scrub back if you want to.
Scared,
I'm scared. I am scared, man.
We have it
Aiden's gonna kill me,
We
bro.
have it physically.
I have not here.
It is.
I would show
Let
you.
the people know.
It's cool.
Let the people know.
Chess boxing might happen this year. I'll leak that to you.
Might happen the year after that too. Who knows?
But yeah, I mean the T situation again, trying to find, and I think Felix found a great way. I really like the T design in the end. But you can again see if I can't remember who asked this on my Twitter, but you can see just like this was the original T design, and this is what ended up getting used for the larger identity for last year's chess boxing championship.
This building block kind of idea of these pieces falling together is something.
See? You can see 6 months ago I said this is really cool, love it.
Noak was playing
I still
with
do.
this as a core visual element.
But again, it was just about finding something that bridged the two. And I'm a big fan of the design.
Obviously, we like to present stuff in different colors, give clients many options. So that makes sure it feels like it fits into the existing product stack. So something like a cream was a color that we'd explored with the existing products. Maybe that's a good base. Maybe it's too similar. You obviously know that the final product that was actually made is none of these colors. We went for the green.
We realized that we make way too many cream t-shirts for these guys,
Mogul
which is totally
loves
fair.
Cream. We love cream, but sometimes you got to make a few decisions. The thing that we ran into, at least I can talk to creatively, is obviously when you design a graphic to exist on a light base, shifting that to exist on a dark base is not inherently very straightforward, because obviously all your light dark values get inverted. When you're working with something like half toning, like this example has, where we knew we wanted this to be a single color screen print, it basically meant that the simple client feedback of how about trying it on a different color actually means how about you redesign the entire thing, because as you can see here on the brown version, this was prior to actually reworking the graphic, where you see that it's just inverted,
Yeah.
and it looks really bad. So you can't just make light dark, and I think that's a rule that you should keep in all of your design. Like that if you're going to rework a design to change primaries, you should start from the ground up, or at least be tactical in your work.
Speaking on the fact that this was last year and I had said that our Figma working systems are better in XYZ, but I'm on the Figma and there's no section here that has the finished T. So again, there's still work to be done,
Slack is a wonderful place, man.
What's up, Saphir?
Shout out Sophia.
Good to see you, man. But yeah, coming back to rooting it back to the photo video, should I say this? I mean, largely the big thing here was that we were all at this point very understanding of the fact that the event wasn't happening anymore. We had to find on both sides. We knew we had product that we needed to sell.
This is an important distinction that we haven't explained yet, is that we designed and ordered all of these goods prior to the event being canceled.
Yeah. So then when we got to this place, it was like, okay, like we still know that we need to promote this collection. Conversations about budget were interesting and things like that. But again, I talked about this earlier, but we had this this grounding concept before about looking at this more from an academia standpoint, right? And my big thing that I felt tied the two things in were like these ideas of just like the trophy case photos, right? Like you go to, I don't know, some prestigious high school that has like boxing or wrestling as a part of it, and also will have a chess club, right? And that's where in very little places in the world where I think those two things can come together, where you can have like a trophy cabinet
This
that
is
has
the idea, yeah.
has a chess trophy and then has boxing gloves and a boxing trophy, right? So it's like, okay, like here's a space and here's an idea that feels like actually grounds these two things. And also like in the sense of executing it, you just need to like find a good studio environment or a place that has nice wooden walls and then you can build a set around. We worked.
It's about taste rather than about breaking rules. And this is obviously something you're seeing a lot of brands do. It's become probably a little bit cliche since, you know, the Aimé Leon Dore effect is totally in full effect. And I'm someone who feels very uniquely in the sense of as much as it looks great, you have to find a way that makes it make sense. Where if you're just a random streetwear brand and you start posting up people wearing hoodies against a backdrop like any ALD shoot, you have to justify it. And I think something that we liked early on was this idea of, if the event isn't happening, what does that mean for this kind of Mogul universe? So we took this kind of approach, this victory lap. We're saying, okay, the championship's taking a hiatus, so instead we're looking back at kind of the history of this team, this kind of event that takes place. So it's going into this heritage of celebrating victory from the past rather than throwing boxes back at them.
Yeah, and I think, again, like it's not lost to me that like the shoot feels and leans very ALD core. I will say the good thing for us is that like there's actual substance and reason for like
I think that's the big
it being what it is.
The big distinction is that this style exists in a way that is purely like form over function.
Mm-hmm.
Finding ways to tie that in a matter of it actually makes sense in terms of the story that you're telling.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just posting up a brand in someone's beautiful New York apartment. And I think that's the distinction we had to make quite early on, is with prop sourcing and with things that step beyond the product itself.
And I think that's like the main thing about how this differed, right? Like last time I was saying for the shoot the year prior, where the set or the location itself did a lot of the heavy lifting. So in that context, like we didn't really work with a set dresser or set designer. We knew what we kind of needed. We needed to source a table. We needed to source a chessboard. But really, like the location could do a lot of the work for us.
We're just recreating the event itself.
But here, it's like we knew it was going to be in a studio environment, and because it's in a studio environment, what actually gives it life is the set, right? So we worked with an incredible set designer who sourced like really great props for us, so we could actually build that life and build this context that we've just been talking about to this point. Mm-hmm. And I will say, like the brilliant thing of just like going through this process and working on more and more shoots is like work with good people. And
build your network, exactly.
And you get good results, right? Like I think that's the beauty of it. And from production side is that you have a vision and you work with good people and you're able to kind of like understand that vision. So shout out Remy, shout out Oreo who took the photos for this as well. But like ended up building like a set that I think was incredibly compelling. We had tons of issues with the location. We didn't scout it, my fault, but it was really last minute. But these walls that you're seeing aren't actually wood. They're plastic, like they're fake wood, which our big problem was that we were looking for this like really luxe rich reflection or tone that you would get from lighting, but you get the exact opposite. We were getting so much reflection,
white spotlights
and it took a lot of work on the lighting and a lot of work on the editing to get it right.
These images were what you're seeing is not what you get in this game.
But again, at the end of the day, like a shoot that like I'm very, very happy with the outcome. Something that like, again, this looks like what we had in mind. I think you can even just tell by some of like the color contrast and the lighting differences that like we did have difficulties with it. And again, something that like, you know, you have more time, that helps a lot. It was something that like ended up being super last minute.
This pivot for the event not taking place to having to reassess where this collection exists in kind of the Mogul space is a matter of days. So this is a real sense of, if not now, then never. And that's a real problem when, back to the conversation of cut and sew versus domestic blanks, the way that we work with Mogul is always this idea of a fan can purchase an item and it's ready or will ship soon. It's not going to have this long production delay. So all of these goods are waiting to be sold. If we scrap the idea of this existing, then all of a sudden Mogul are left with units of clothing that is not going anywhere.
I just realized no one has been able to see anything that we've been talking about, but that's fine.
The legend.
Okay, this is what we're talking about. And we'll go back a bit just so you can go back and look at these things. But like again, like really just like looking at honing in on this, the general aesthetic that we're talking about that captures this like element of like, I guess like academics and sports. And we're obviously like knew that we were going to be in a student environment and looking at taking portraits especially. So just like finding a
I
good
think
amount of references.
we knew we didn't want it to be too perfect. This kind of idea of you're in this space where these competitors are only focused on the thing that they do. They don't care about the messy stacks of books. They don't care about things being out of place. It's this idea of this is a space that is purely for like hyper focused, like slightly quirky, but very like athlete or dominated. So you have this concept of kind of competition first. They're celebrating their victories rather than this kind of ALD style place you in like an apartment type vibe.
I'll just kind of scroll through
Yeah, I mean,
these.
hopefully people saw the photos because they're great. They were posted. Oreo killed it. This is a fun one of sourcing people for photo shoots. Always challenging, but Ludwig pulled through and Sam came out, killed it. It's always nice to have, you know, full range of representation in your shoots. We don't want to just shoot a guy stood in front of something. It's nice to have different bodies so people can see what these photos look like if you're tall, what they look like if you're shorter, if you're a guy, if you're a gal. I think that's something that's really important that a lot of kind of e-commerce brands obviously have looked onto. We're not reinventing the wheel there, but when you look at influencer shoots, it's important that you don't just put Ludwig in the clip.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think really in terms of what I can think of covering, this feels like pretty much everything. I mean, obviously this might have extended a bit further and we had different plans, especially as the year went on and other products that we didn't end up launching, obviously. But hopefully, it's an interesting one because if it comes out, if it happens again this year, it'll be interesting to see how we approach it, just given the situation, given product stacks and things like that. But you know, hopefully that does. We went to the event and it was actually like incredible and really, really fun. So do have hopes that they're able to find a way to make it work. But yeah, outside of that, I mean, hopefully this was interesting and hopefully, I don't know, hopefully you learned something, I guess. But same time, I don't want to make it seem like that. But yeah, I think this is just something that we're going to look to continue to do. I don't know if I'm going to watch this back. I hope I do. I hope I don't find that weird. But, you know, just find ways to do this better, but also just like find this way to like continue to find ways to cover and provide that insight into projects that we do. And I think like even just on our side, like this is very beneficial just to be able to like go back and look at how our processes have changed and even just like look back and like, again, like organizing these things. Like we're looking to do more archival work even when we were looking to do like the zine that we did at the end of last year for the holidays. Just like about like how can we better document things, whether that's like in our own processes like on Figma or whether it's here, you know, where we're able to provide more of like a lens and an avenue into the things that we do. So I think like, yeah, again, I hope that this isn't the last one we do, and I'm pretty sure that it won't be. And yeah, I think the big goal that we have here is that we get comments here, we get feedback, and it's something that we're able to take in and continue to do these and continue to provide, and hopefully it is something that's beneficial, hopefully it's something that's insightful as well. Yeah, thank you, I appreciate that. So yeah, again, like looking forward to continue to do this. If anyone has any feedback, chat, comments after this will be a VOD.
Anything that makes sense. I think it's just something that we feel passionate about in the case of we want to show people how things are done. There's a lot of gatekeeping that takes place, particularly around the concept of making things. I think that goes across whether it's graphic design, whether it's about producing fashion, whatever it is. I think there's obviously steps that we can't go into too much detail with, obviously client relationships that exist, but as much as it's possible, this is stuff that we want to talk about. And I think it's important that, yeah, this is available.
I think the other thing that I've been thinking about even leading up to today is that I think our goal with this is that we have like the client here, right? Because I think there's so much about this that it would be great to see like the insight that happens along the way as well, or like how certain decisions that we made that were informed by them, like why they made those decisions as well. And I think like we've also just like had this like long-term dream or ambition that, you know, you as a fan of Ludwig, for example, can understand like his role and his involvement in these things, right? Because I think I said this at the start, but I think these things always end up being better, even just like personally as fans, if there's an understanding that it's not just, oh, like they hired someone, they never saw any of these things, they're just pushing it to sell, they're just trying to make money off of me, versus, oh no, like they're actually creating something that's uniquely their own, they had a role in, they made these decisions, it's an extension of them.
It's an active process.
Yeah, it's an extension of them outside of just being a way for them to make money off of me. So I think that level of insight and the ability for like them to be able to talk about that Yeah, no, I agree. I think for this one, and I think Aiden would. So I think like we find the right project that makes sense too. I think that's something that like he would be more than open to. So I think that's something that we'll look to do as well. Because like there's a lot of these decisions even when we're talking about like picking certain products or why we did this fleece versus the other fleece, where we can sit here and be like, oh, we wish we did this other fleece, and
creative decision making.
That decision was probably because of like how they thought that the sales would do, but they obviously have much more insight on that. So I would love to go down that path as well. Yeah, and just speaking beyond that, just really high level. Yeah, this like exists as the first step for us of like seeing what we want to do with more public facing content. Something that we're gonna like look to continue to do. We have a kind of more public launch and rebrand that we're looking to push out very soon. Yeah, I don't know, very soon, later this year.
Soon come.
You can kind of see on the graphics for this one, our logo has changed and things like that. But with that is going to come for us, like we want to be able to have, in some senses, an internal brand, an external facing brand, to give, you know, for you guys here, for example, you're not our clients. We don't make money off of you, but we still want to create something that builds something for people who don't just intersect with our business. So we're going to continue to look to create content like this, whether that's through events, whether through other programs that we're looking to build, but create like a separate external facing brand that's about like bringing creatives together, about building like educational content. So in that way, again, like I want to make sure that we keep doing this, and I also want to make sure that we're continuing to kind of like build on that, because for me, that's where things get really interesting, right? Is we're able to tap into the networks that we build and the campaigns that we build to create and build for other people, whether that's through opportunities, whether that's through events or experiences, or whether that's through educating. That's just something that's like deeply interesting to all of us here. So yeah, hopefully you found this interesting and engaging, and yeah, hope you tune into the next one.
Appreciate you all coming. Thank you.
Thank you guys.